Welcome to the future of the First Amendment's interpretation in the United States. While the words themselves are stagnant, thousands of people in this country are employed to interpret the meaning of the Constitution, including the First Amendment. I chose this topic for a few reasons. One, I've always been interested in law and the way our Constitution is interpreted, and a bit of a libertarian, and I'm a strong supporter of the Bill of Rights. Two, it is known that the Supreme Court opinions are ever-changing. Stare decisis can only go so far, and although the Supreme Court tries to avoid overruling previous interpretations, it's not uncommon. 3. The future of the interpretations apply to everyone. Nobody in the United States is immune from the effects of future interpretations of the First Amendment, so it's important for us to be aware or have an idea of what's to come. Before we discuss how the First Amendment is interpreted, we first must know what it is. It protects our four main liberties: freedom of religion, expression, assembly, and petition of the government. Freedom of religion today contains government funding of private religious education, such as not allowing states to withhold funds for private education based on religion, or religious exemptions from certain actions, such as serving a gay couple in 2018. Freedom of expression can also include forcing workers to be part of a union to prevent free riders. It can also include forcing abortion centers to inform patients of other options. Expression also includes the realm of expressive association, such as allowing private groups to not associate with certain people. This includes allowing the removal of a gay scoutmaster based on homosexuality alone in 2000, or forcing women to be allowed into the JC's organization. One of the decisions with the most negative public reaction was in 1989, when the Supreme Court ruled burning the flag was protected. Attempts to prevent the release of a violent video game were overruled when the video game was deemed a method of communication. Pornography and videos of animal cruelty even fall under the category of freedom of expression, and most of these rights are protected. Freedom of the press falls under expression, and very rarely is the government allowed to step in. This was seen with the Pentagon Papers in the 70s, when the Supreme Court allowed the New York Times and Washington Post to release thousands of pages of classified material. On top of what the First Amendment is about, the other component in examining the future of its interpretation will be the future of how we communicate. In the past 20 years, humans have begun to type more than they write, and this trend will continue. We could see more speech-to-text options to save even more time, allowing us to communicate with each other more than ever, as talking is faster than typing, which is substantially faster than writing. Another area to examine are online platforms. Today we call them social media, but 20 years from now we could be airdropping posts on them with chips in our heads rather than having to log onto a cell phone. How could the government regulate certain speech then? Or what are the rules to someone using a speech-to-text that misheard and published something false? What would private companies or the government do about deepfakes, where people are impersonating other people with flawless editing? These are all possible cases that could appear before the Supreme Court in the next 20 years. An interesting trend in the United States is the amount of hate groups and hate crimes. Of course, hate speech is no longer protected by the First Amendment as of 1942 in Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire. The idea of fighting words has evolved since then, but generally, any kind of hate speech is not protected. The trend in increased number of hate crimes and hate groups in recent years is in part due to a demographic shift in the United States. Our country is less white and less Christian today than ever, and because of how diverse we are becoming, there's been a bit of an increase in violence against minority religions and groups. While hate crimes against Jewish people have steadily declined in the last 10 years, crimes against Muslims have increased. The amount of hate groups in the United States has also increased steadily since the 90s. The Supreme Court has trended a more conservative direction since the Nixon era, especially in the last decade when President Trump appointed 3 new justices to the Supreme Court, leaving a conservative 6-3 majority. The conservative majority has had a big impact on decisions recently, and we can take a look at the way justices vote in polarized cases. Here are all the 5-4 cases in 2021, and you can see how the 3 liberal justices have voted together with 1 or 2 conservative justices. There was not a 5-4 decision last term where the liberal justices were in disagreement. Or take a look at the polarized cases where justices voted along appointment party lines. This can explain the increase in 6-3 decisions we have seen in the last 2 terms. As far as the steeped categories go, obviously an important one is politics. A Democrat interpretation of the First Amendment would be one that justifies political correctness and stricter regulation of fighting words and hate speech. Democrats would like more organizational fact-checking along with more restrictions on the government funding Christian religious schools. A Republican interpretation of the First Amendment would be one that allows the government to fund religious schools, along with one that stands up for online freedoms even if speech isn't politically correct or factually true. Another steeped category important to the future interpretations is demographics. A more diverse country might be one more susceptible to hate speech and discrimination, and you can see the younger generations of Americans on this graph is much more diverse than the older generation. This is a preferred scenario. Just kidding, funny joke. No, but it's probable. The conservatives continue their majority over the Supreme Court, and this leads to many right-leaning decisions being released on a 6-3 vote. In this future, we see the Supreme Court ruling on internet free speech continued as it did in Reno versus ACLU, and striking down attempts to limit speech online when it came to indecent behavior. The court will also continue to state-sponsored religious behavior, especially when it comes to the Christian religion. We will see them uphold decisions such as Espinoza versus Montana DOR, when they forced Montana to give tax exemptions to religious schools alongside public schools. In the upcoming case of Fatia v. Neal, they may discriminate against non-minority religions when deciding whether a gun range can kick a Muslim man out solely based on his religion. We could also see the court uphold the hundreds of bills in different states on their way to being passed in the area of critical race theory in schools, and the court takes the state's side when it comes to restricting what children are allowed to learn about. This is a possible scenario if we were to see more time with a Democratic president in the coming decade. We could see cases where the court steps in and allows for government censorship online due to too much misinformation and hate speech on out-of-control platforms such as Twitter, overruling Reno versus ACLU. There would be more of an emphasis on political correctness as well. We could also see the court build up separation between church and state again and go back to separating the two completely. This would lead to an overruling of Bromfield v. Brown, 1960, when the court upheld Pennsylvania state law forcing businesses to close on Sundays. The court could also turn Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado, a case that upheld the individual right to deny service to a gay couple in 2018. This one would need an especially far-left court because it was a 7-2 decision that included a liberal justice. We could see the court move to remove God from government slogans such as the Pledge or buildings. In the upcoming 303 Creative versus Elenis, we see whether a website can discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, and the liberal court might rule in favor of the LGBT community and overturn Masterpiece Cake Shop decided 3 years ago. Our last scenario would certainly be the preferred scenario, and a plausible one too. We see the wall between church and state known, as the government will have more measures preventing it from favoring a certain religion. We could also see a good compromise between the Republican and Democrat preference in schools, with CRT being taught and no limits on education in the classroom, but with an increased transparency with parents being well informed with what the government is teaching kids. We could see private online platforms such as Twitter and Facebook regulating themselves, with the government not being allowed to step in online speech any more than it could step in speech in public places. Thank you for taking the time to learn about the First Amendment, and may our freedoms live on.